tribes that have settled are expected to take on hefty social issues that they cannot do.
That was another one of Bob's comments, so I remember him saying that, do not let the Crown off its Article 3 obligations. He said, we're here to do this and rebuild the tribal estate and grow our assets. We are not here to be a proxy for the Crown's Article 3 responsibilities.
Because I have been asked that question many times. Why aren't you housing your people? Why aren't you fixing up the main street of Ngāruawai? Why aren't you fixing up the main street of Huntly?
Why aren't you?
And I said, that's not our job. That's what we have councils for. We are ratepayers.
Kia ora tātou, kua tai mai koutou ki roto I tēnei o ngā whare atāhua I tēnei rā. Nō reira, kei te mihi atu rā kia koutou, te kāhui, he kāhui meki, nō te ao papāho, nō te rā ao. Nō reira, nau mai piki mai haere mai, ki tō mātou whare kōrero te rā nei. We'll start at the beginning, which was the beginning of the contemporary settlement process. Kids, your thoughts, creating a bit of that backstory to that. You've prepared some stuff, so kei a koe te wā.
Well, by the time we got to the actual settlement in 1995, 30 years ago, remember this was the year before MMP, where Jim Bolger was the Prime Minister. The country had its very first treaty negotiations minister, Sir Douglas Graham. There was no whakaata Māori. There was no online news because there was no online yet. Cell phones were just coming in. Basic text messaging was still 4 years away. Sky TV was only 5 years old and only had a handful of channels. There were only 6 kura kaupapa in the motu by then, and grew after that. Te Kārere had its few minutes a day, 5 days a week. Mana News had its few minutes a day on national radio and the iwi stations. Those were the 2 little bright brown spots in the media landscape. Really, it was mainstream media that was completely king. We heard about Waikato Times, Herald, Radio New Zealand, TVNZ. TV3 was only just really getting going at that point as well. We were brown specks in a very Pākehā media. So that's the context was very, very different. Our ability to get our messages out, our ability to even do our own stories in the newsrooms that we worked in was very, very different than what we have today. And I don't think we can understate how much it has changed and how hostile it was at times. So if we look at the context of trying to cover stories, we often weren't allowed to cover our own stories because the mainstream view was either scared or hostile. So they just didn't want to do them. Or at that time, we used to say amongst ourselves that the only time you saw Māori on the front page of the Herald is if they're mad, bad or sad. And things have changed a lot. So the context was very different.
Wena?
Prior to the 1990s, we had been ignored or neglected. Interwoven with that was a lot of hostility, as Chris had mentioned. We also had a government, again, as Chris had mentioned, that was new to this treaty settlement business. They didn't really want to deal with the Māori question of settling treaty grievances, but realised that in the end they had to do something because there were too many restless natives that were causing, a big problem for the government. I interviewed a few people in that time who admitted later on, much, much later, that they did not know what they were doing in terms of treaty settlements. They were feeling their way, basically. And this was, the chief negotiator for the Crown, who is now Sir Brian Roche. They would make it up as they go. And you also had Māori negotiators who weren't so much, they weren't floundering. They had a purpose and a goal that they were working towards. And it was just a matter of making sure the Crown came on board the waka. And they were very clever about how they went about doing that. It wasn't just serious business. There was one point there where, the guys would go out and have a whiskey with the Crown. And have just a sit down, bit of drinking, bit of late night talking, and come to agreements that way. So those were the things that we weren't reporting on, but were happening.
There was no rule book.
No rule book. The rules were being made as they went along.
Would you say it was more pragmatic at that time, just to get things done, rather than this time. We tend to overthink what settlements look like. You're nodding your head. Sue?
I believe so, yeah. It was a pretty unique time in terms of leadership, both on the government's or the Crown side and Māoridom. We had different leaders back then. They were able to talk directly to each other. And the comment about pragmatic, I believe so. And I think that someone said to me recently, who had been a part of the team, negotiating team, that National was the more pragmatic party to deal with, which is one of the reasons why they believe that the settlement happened, because they were about solution.
Nodding your head, Ruben?
Yeah, no, it was an environment where it was more practical to talk to one another. You had relationships that you could call on. And often we used to hear about late night drinks, you know. Bolger was, he used to like to have a whiskey, you know, and you'd hear some of the conversations that would come out of those late night whiskies, you know, and
Open the bottle, screw up the top and chuck it in the bin. We're not leaving until the bottle or the issue's solved.
yeah.
Without the lawyers, too, without the lawyers, who complicated things, who weren't about pragmatism.
Maramina?
I was go on now, I'm going back, pre-settlement, so it was around, I was at the New Zealand Herald, the Granny Herald, so I was the only Māori in there, purposely put there by mentors who said you had to get in there. And so it was about 87, I was heading down my cadetship. I served in Tainui. So it was Tainui who basically trained me, whacked me, slapped me, taught me, saved me many a time. So that was about 87, 88. That was my first experience was Kaukop, the Court of Appeal. And that was quite a turning point just before the negotiations really started happening. And no one would talk. They certainly weren't going to talk to the Herald. They didn't have a clue who I was. And I wanted to get the story. Again, I was fresh, naive. So I went out to the Trust Board officers. They said they weren't giving interview. And I sat on the steps and I said, well, I'll wait. I'll wait, because the Court of Appeal decision had come out. And I waited there for about 2 hours. And then you can imagine the looks on their faces when all of them finally came out and just were looking at this girl sitting there. But I got the interview with Hare Puke at the time, and my brother rang me that night here. He said, what are you doing? I'm getting calls from Tainui. Who the hell is Maramina Roderick? And that was my introduction to the Tainui Trust Board, as it was then. But I was thinking about it, you've got to look at the context of the day, what was happening in this area, especially within Waikato Tainui, and it was a real time of renaissance for Māori. So you had the kohanga coming through, you had the kura coming through, so people were fighting for their reo. But I remember my baby being at the kohanga and others experienced the same, getting death threats and disgusting letters in the letterbox, what they were going to do to our kids for learning te reo. And then the thought of Kaukop and Māori might get land, which would be a huge loss for non-Māori. Doc, I remember Doc was dead against it at the time. Interesting, because now those uara, those values are now, that kaitiangaship is used by Doc today. But that is the kind of context and the world that our negotiators were working in at the time, let alone thoughts of concern within their own people. So they were being hit. And at the time you're just living it and you're doing it, but it really put it into the idea that Māori could have a settlement. The Cold Court case started it. For me in the media anyway, I started turning towards Tainui.
Mm. And of course you broke at the time the pan-tribal settlement in terms of fisheries at the Herald. So you had a bit of runway lead in to this process, and so how it related to the Waikato settlement.
We had so much happening out around at the time, and I seemed to be out at Tiranga Waiwai every other week. Poor Bob, as we called him there, Mahuta was like a kutu. out there always asking, but I was honest with them. And I guess being honest, I was able to talk frankly to them. And there was a trust built, though. And you've got to earn that trust. It is not given to you. And I remember, in 91, was it 91? Billy T. James died. So that all blew up at the time. And I got the call from Wāhi, from the pā, to say, Billy T's on his way down. So obviously the trust had been built over that time. All the media were outside his home in Auckland. And I rang through to the Herald and I said, he's coming. And they said, no, he's not. He's at the house. And I said, if the pā says he's coming, he is coming. And we were there. Me and my photographer got the only pictures of him coming on. But you have to build trust for them to give you that call.
All right, so we've heard some of the discussions or some of the thoughts that Maramena spoke about. What I found during that time, Hone, is during interviews, you could quite often extract some fairly robust thinking i roto I tō tāua nei reo Māori. Mm-hmm. And our speakers seem to be a little bit more guarded in English. Did you see that in Māori language broadcasting back then?
Uncle Koro.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think it was a predicament of the climate around Te Reo Māori had a lot to do with it, because that had come through, as we'll all remember, during the Labour government of 1984 to 1990. And Te Reo Māori had been made an official language, and of course all of a sudden it was branded in newsrooms across the country. But we weren't used to using it. So those of us who were working in programs like Te Karere were definitely given a purview of the way that our people were starting to open up in Te Reo Māori and telling us a story, a narrative that was completely different to what they were telling mainstream news. It wasn't the fact that it wasn't newsworthy. That wasn't the point. It was almost like, let me take an example.
There was safety in using the reo, hey?
There was a safety in using the reo, but it was also like with people like Eva, who would invite you to her place to do an interview, and she would mother you with toast and jam and sit you down, and she already had the confidence that you were on side as a Māori language reporter because you could understand her point of view, her struggle, that she didn't have to tread around the edges. It was that kind of an approach. And I think that at the end of the day, I cut my teeth on Te Karere, and I will be forever thankful for it, because I'd come through a postgraduate journalism course with Brian Priestley, who said to me, leave your Maori kit at the door when you come in here. Don't bring your Maori kit in here. And I thought, oh my God, who are you? Why? What's this Māori kit business? And of course, I plonked it straight on my desk so everybody in the class could see it. Linda Clark was in that my year. She giggled. And I thought to myself, okay, I'll do this. I'll do the objective piece and get both sides of the story. The difference with Māori language speakers as talent was that they were very free to open up about beyond the how, what, why, when and where the event happened. They wanted to talk about how it affected their whānau, how it affected their people, and that came back, right back to the Raupatu claim, because we had all been affected by it growing up in this environment. It was, and I think Te Reo gave us a big hand up as journalists, and definitely cut my teeth on being able to see the Māori purview.
Can I just say, it wasn't just Pākehā Tauiwi who were doing that. You'd turn up to Māori and you'd say kia ora, and they would go, oh, you're one of those, aren't you? Mm. Oh, here we go. Because they were needing to shift as well. So again, it was quite a turbulent time of change and thinking for everyone. And for Māori to understand or accept, it's kei te pai, it's okay. We don't have to be in fear of it.
Some of it I worked out were native speakers. They were actually better speaking and because they thought in Māori spoke in Māori, English, they had to translate in their own heads before they spoke English. Koro was a classic one. Ta'achi Tairoa was another one. And I never realised this. It would be frustrating at Radio New Zealand. They'd do these clunky interviews that weren't very good and you think, oh man, that was a pain. But when we got to Mana News, and if they were interviewed i te reo Māori first, then you did English one straight afterwards, it was like a completely different thing because the thoughts were already formed. They had their whakaaro, they knew what they wanted to get across and it came out. So always tried to make sure they did their reo Māori version first.
They could also get across concepts and things that you couldn't get in Pākehā. The spirituality of things, when they're talking about mamae, the hurt of it all, those sorts of things were conveyed better in our own language. And that made the difference.
I think the traditional media has struggled and continues to struggle, and we'll call it now the legacy media, with coverage of things Māori. And I go back to when I started in the media in 1960. There were no Māori in the newsroom. The only Māori coverage came through a colleague, the late Michael King. So he was Pākehā. He wrote the book on Te Puia. He covered a whole lot of Māori events in a way that I think that Michael built up the trust with Waikato Tainui, the hapu, and he was able to represent things Māori into a Pākehā-based, circulated to Pākehā media, the Waikato Times. Now I look at the media today and I don't see huge changes in that. There are not hundreds of Māori journalists. I think of a brilliant young Māori journalist that I had quite a lot to do with, Te Anga Nathan. And I remember when he struggled being sent by the Waikato Times out to Hopu Hopu to cover controversial meetings. So he was either a journalist, but he was a Maori journalist, and worse than that, he was Waikato Tainui. So he got a hammering from some of the people in the tribe because they couldn't separate his function as a journalist with being a tribal member. The thing I find as a Pākehā now is that where I get my Maori news from Maori television, which I think does a superb job in presenting the Maori perspective. During the settlement process, I don't actually think the mainstream media understood what was happening. And for me personally, and I was involved with the tribe since about 1994, I got asked by someone, oh, are you going on the train down to Wellington? And I said, no, I haven't been asked. And I didn't realise that you didn't have to be asked, that you could have got on the train and gone down there. But secondly, and I'm a bit ashamed about this, I didn't realise the significance of that settlement. Subsequently, yes, I've been embraced by the tribe and I've had the lessons and understand it clearly. But this is what's happening today in New Zealand. The legacy media need to have a greater understanding of things Maori, employ Maori journalists to advise on the protocols. I mean, how do you get onto a marae? You know, who do I talk to? So these are good questions to raise in this environment.
You talked about hostilities before, and you know, as a journo working in the mainstream media, but also from here. So when I used to come down, they used to have hui down here to talk about settlement all the time, and I remember the little gate down there with the arm on it as you come in. I kind of twitch every time I see it.
Oh, because the guard post.
Yeah, the guard post, because when I see it, it used to go down, you know, be open, and then they would see me in my bright yellow Waikato Times car, and it would go down. And then suddenly all the boys would come out and say, where do you think you're going? And I said, well, I'm going in there, whether you like it or not. So open up the gate, otherwise I'll drive through it. And so in the end, they used to open it up, but you know, you'd get flack for it because the other point is that you had a job to do, and it was to report on what was happening. So my job was reporting on the internal things that were going on at those hui, and I quite enjoyed it for a while. But then, you know, like there was another conflict going on in the newsroom in that as well. And so they wanted a story that was going to make it sound like World War III was starting to happen, which it kind of was in a way at some of those, because you remember kind of Gareth Seymour and them used to stir up the pot every time they turned up at one of these things, you know? And so, yeah, it was kind of it was a bit of a laugh for me, but you know, to me, it wasn't the point. You had to kind of cut through all of that and try and just see the facts for what they were. But it did create some hostilities on both sides, and so you get it either way, whether you were Māori or whether you were Juno, you were copying it both ways. So you weren't winning anyway.
Gordon mentioned the train of the tribe going down for the signing of the settlement of Parliament. I was working at News Talk ZB in the Wellington newsroom, and we didn't cover it, News Talk ZB, because what's this train with all these Maoris coming to town for? No one knew. So it was like, oh, okay. And it pretty much got ignored because no one understood.
Picking up on Ruben's point, though, Jason, is that I think for myself as a Māori language journalist, there was also the other side of the coin. The challenge was that Māori talent, 9 times out of 10, were the only people that were speaking Māori that we would interview, but occasionally there would be others, but was that they would expect you not to hold them to account because they wanted the freedom to talk. They wanted the freedom to talk around the story and to give them time to work in towards the actual nub of the story, which was whatever you were there to interview them about. And they wanted to talk freely. And I kind of felt that after a while, I started to feel as a Māori language journalist that I changed and that I started to target and to become far more conscious of holding Māori talent to account, whatever the story was. So there was 2 sides to the way that we were covering Māori stories, I think.
There was one issue that I looked at, and that was before settlement, Waikato Tainui, Te Pākehā, were sitting out there on their own, for their own people, and it was like, well, what's this got to do with Pākehā? Suddenly the settlement came, and there was a realisation that Waikato Tainui would become an economic powerhouse in the Pākehā world as well. Now major property holder, major ratepayer in the city, all of these economic drivers. And I remember that we had Sir Tipene O'Regan from Ngaitahu come to a national conference of the Public Relations Institute. And of course, being communicators, he was talking to communicators. And the point that he made was at that conference, look, we employed Pākehā techniques to engage with the Pākehā. Because there were 2 audiences, weren't there? There was the Maori audience, and then the Pākehā who had agreed in the settlement situation to return the money for land stolen, and suddenly there was a greater degree of interest in things Maori. So Maori needed to embrace the Pākehā techniques to communicate not only to the tribe, which at that time with Waikato Tainui, you were talking about 25,000 people on the tribal roll. Well, now it's up to, I think, 90,000. And so you've got 2 distinct audiences to talk to. Firstly, the Maori audience, Waikato Tainui, and then secondly, the Pākehā audience, who probably doesn't care too much, but should be knowing these things about the importance of settlement. And I'm working on a treaty claim with Ngāti Wairere, just helping out on a pro bono basis, and they want to take a piece of land back in the middle of the city that was confiscated in 1860, but didn't come back in 1992 into that land holding, and now they want to know, well, why didn't the land come back? It's a sacred parsite. So these are things that have got to be communicated to the Pākehā who live next to the site and to the hapu that wants to know, why can't we have the site back and now? And what's the redress?
I don't think, sorry Sue, I don't think we can understate that hostility. We talk about it, what it was like in the newsrooms. But Jim Bolger told me years after they'd done Waikato Tainui, Ngāi Tahu obviously, over a few wihiki, that he said he was taking phone calls from senior long-standing members of the National Party around the time of the settlement and then the year later, Ngāi Tahu. He said, "Oh, Jim, you've got to slow down on this treaty stuff. You're going to lose us the election." They were worried about the 96 election. And he took great delight in personally ringing them back when National's majority went up. And that 96, that was the first MMP election as well. He took great delight in saying, see, there was nothing to worry about. But, you know, half of his cabinet and most of his caucus didn't support the treaty settlement process. Doug Graham got to that point, like Gordon had said, like others had said, where, you know, the noise got to the point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. And Doug Graham said, we've got to do something about this. And his Prime Minister backed him. Sometimes they were two people, or Bill Birch always backed Jim Bolger as well. So there was three people in the government who carried that whole process forward on their shoulders. And they just did, because Jim used to say, I'm driving the bus, get on with me or get off. And they pushed it through. Without that, I'm not sure it would have happened for another few more years.
Closing comments on this part, Sue.
I mean, my background was I was brought on by a Pākehā who was trying to brown up the newsrooms at the time in the early 80s. So he was running introductory courses in Wellington. And then having worked in a Pākehā environment for some years, by the early 90s, I was then working for my own trust board in Maniapoto, and we had founded our own newspaper. And within a few years, there were 7 of us. And we held our own hui, and we brought down Pākehā editors from the Herald, from the Times, from television, trying to explain to them why we were all trying to tell our own stories in our own way. And when we were all together in this hui, I saw some lights go on, sort of. I said, but it's difficult when you send your brown reporters out to a marae, for example. They're supposed to know the kaupapa. They're supposed to know what to do, the tikanga. Don't send your Māori cameramen and photographers out to walk in front of people in the middle of a hui. They don't do that, or they know not to do it, but because of the Pākehā editors that they answered to at the time, they had to do it, sort of thing. But anyway, moving on to the Māori thing and uncovering our own stories in our own way, we actually found that people were, again with Maramena, quite right relationships. Whakapapa helped, trust me, on our own side. They had to talk to us because they were related to us, you know. Or, that's my niece, all right, yes, I'll talk to her. All right then, yes, I'll talk to her. And so those were the kind of realms that we were getting into. I had a lot easier road because through the settlement or approaching the settlement, I didn't have to ask anybody for permission to publish or to publish what we published. And Sir Robert said to me, why don't they write what we're doing? And I said to him, because it doesn't fit what they want to say. And he said, well, how do we say it so that it fits what they want us to say? And I said, well, that won't work because what you're doing not what they want to report. And he said to me, well, how do I fix it? I said, well, you generally have to pay for it. It's called advertising. But then in reviving Māori newspapers that hadn't been, you know, in Tokyo and all of that, I mean, that sort of led us to our own communications. And from then on, it was actually sort of better because we didn't have, you know, emails, internet or anything, cell phones. Everything was face-to-face pretty much. But trying to get the messages out to our own people that good things are happening if you choose to read them.
I mean, we weren't saving lives,
No.
let's be honest. So it's going back to what those negotiators were dealing with, the hostility, the fear, the uncertainty on both sides that they had to navigate through. And I wonder to the detriment of their own health.
Yeah.
Because they had to focus everything on their iwi. And that is high stress. And I remember talking to the negotiators one time and 2 things came out. One, they did have their techniques. A great technique they used in a negotiation was that they got into the room first and they went round on the seats on the other side. They just dropped them down. a couple of centimetres. So they just had that, they knew in their minds they had it on them. They were just a little bit lower. And another comment I remember was the loneliness, because someone had to make the call.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a easy place to be for the future of the mokopuna and the iwi.
Sir Robert has been brought up a number of times, and well, I want to tease some stuff out around that. He took on that responsibility to negotiate directly with the Crown. If you have a look at the settlement in terms of Waitangi Tribunal hearings, once again, very unique in that process, in that it was a direct negotiation. What are some of your recollections of dealing with him at that time? Go to you, Reuben.
In December, I think it was 94, there was a hui down at Tūranga, and it was around the heads of agreement. They were about to initialise the heads of agreement. So hui at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was basically the trust board saying, we're going to initial it, but we would like to take you guys along for the ride with us. And as you can imagine, Gareth and co, they didn't like the whole idea at all, and they caused a huge fuss at the back of the hall. And it was kind of amusing at first because poor old Hari didn't know how to take it, didn't know how to handle it. And it was the first time I'd seen Bob just kind of lose it. And it was kind of funny. I've got to do this, sorry. He stood up at the table, and he goes, "Come on in, you little mongrels. Come on, let's go." And then he said, "Come on, you little mongrels." And he started walking out the door. And, the funny part about it was that, they had the rugby league team were there as security. And they were supposed to be securing those guys at the back. But then they had to secure him. And he's still going out the door going, "Come on, you little mongrels. Come on, come on." And he's going like this as he's walking out the door. And I'm thinking, what is he doing? And so I followed him. I tried to follow him out the door, and he was gone within a flash. And I was thinking, where has he gone? And there was a lot of upheaval inside, and of course Gareth and them are yelling, "He's trying to assault me, he's trying to assault me." He'd gone well before then, he didn't really care. And then I had to ask around to see where I could find him. And of course, I found him down at the pub at the Delta. He was down there with Binga Haggy, and they were having a game of pool. And he was calm as anything, and I couldn't understand it. I'm thinking to myself, why did he do that? And that's what I wanted to ask him. And it was one of the stories I didn't actually report because I thought that was just too much fun. I have to keep that. That's just for me, And so I went down to the pub and I saw him and I said, "Why did you do that?" And he goes, "All will be revealed." He said, "There's going to be a better story coming up tonight when we initial that heads of agreement." He said, "If you want to stick around till then, it'll be quite late, but if you want to stick around till then, we'll do it." And I think they signed it at about 10 or 11 o'clock that night, the heads of agreement. And that just set the pathway for the settlement. So that was my kind of enduring memory of that man.
He was also notorious, I remember a couple of occasions, for dodging media calls. And I remember ringing the university, he'll get back to you. Well, he didn't. And so I had to grab him at Tūranga Waiwai at that same, it was a different event. But we learnt where they stayed when they went to Wellington. Sir Graham Latimer would stay at where was it?
James Cook.
At the James Cook. There were a whole bunch of hotels where the different iwi would stay. And then we'd quite often get them that way because, they'd pick up the telephone in the bedroom.
Api Mahuika and him stayed at the West Plaza. Archie stayed around at the one on Oriental Bay. So you knew where they stayed. You could sneak in maybe at breakfast time and catch them for a kōrero.
Sue, what are some of your recollections of him during those most turbulent times where he had to be the leader?
Oh, who mentioned the isolation and the loneliness? That was him. I mean, huge responsibility on his shoulders to drag everybody with him. I mean, especially if it was our own, In an interview with me, he lamented those that were opposed to the settlement. He understood their reasoning and why. For example, when I spoke to him about Eva Rickard, he said to me, "I'm sad that she's not with us." And I said, "Why isn't she with you?" And he said, "Because she wants me to do everything. She wants me to do the rivers, the harbours and the land." He said, "We can't do it all at once. It's too big." So we've fallen out on that, and I'm sad about that. you know. We had funny little moments about things, and he could predict what was going to happen. He never, as far as I know, he never went into a room unless he knew the result. It was never the meeting that you were in. It's not the meeting that you needed to be in. You needed to be in the before meeting and the after meeting, because that's when everything really happened. But he was notorious for research. He had to know what as the leader, he had to know that every time they went into a room to have an argument, that they would win it. Because if he didn't, it took him backwards and didn't progress what they were trying to do. That was my experiences anyway.
I agree with Sue in terms of the leadership. Having sat in at the old Tainui Maori Trust Board meetings, the late Dr. Harley Puki was the chairman, but you could see how people deferred to Robert at that time, not Sir Robert, but Robert, and he was clearly the leader. And I think for the decision to be made to deal direct with the Crown was a fabulous decision, because you're dealing at the top. The people who make the decisions, the people from Waikato Tainui who made decisions, they were meeting together. But the most brilliant outcome for me personally was the top-up deal, which has subsequently been talked about, analysed. When we had the college up and running here, it was debated and discussed. It was absolutely a brilliant aspect of that settlement, which continues today and will do so until they've done the Aotea, Harbour, Auckland, you name it. There are a number of very important settlements still to come.
If I could just add a little bit about the leadership at the time though. He was one of those giants of Māoridom who could pick up the phone, call Ngaitahu, call up north, call Tuwhareto, call the East Coast, and things would happen. And that was because the leadership at that time, they were all kind of the same. Everything was chief to chief, you know, and then the minions below, the negotiating team took care of it. The officials. But one of the things that I found out was that the appreciation by Sir Doug Graham of the grievance was vital. If he didn't, he called it a major crime. If he hadn't have understood what Waikato were wanting and why they were wanting it, I'm not sure that it would have gone any further than what it, the progression. And as for your comment about the direct negotiation, only way to go, we might still have been waiting in the tribunal for something to happen.
Yeah, you're talking about those leaders talking to each other.
Yeah.
Tātipini and Bob did talk to each other about, remember when it was originally called, it was the ratchet clause, because it would ratchet up. But everyone decided ratchet didn't sound quite right, so then it became the relativity clause. But they talked about being the first two cabs off the rank. There was no playbook. The $1 billion fiscal envelope, or the fiscal cap in the fiscal envelope, again, Bolger told me later on, I said, where did that number come from? He said, that's the highest number we thought we could get away with the rest of the electorate, with the rest of the public at the time. Did we ever think it was going to be enough? Probably not. But we had nothing. We had nothing to work on. There was no precedent. We had to start somewhere. So that's where the $1 billion came from. And I understood completely what Jim said about why, that 17% of those first two major claims had to be, regardless of what the quantum ended up being at the end of the day. And they all talked to each other about that.
But with Sir Robert and Sir Tipene, their thing was, with the fishery settlement being included as well in that cap, their settlement, Waikato settlement, Ngaitahu settlement, that went over more than $500 million. And they knew that there were hundreds of iwi all coming forward with their own settlements. Waikato was considered to be selling out on the rest of Māoridom. And that was not the case, because they came, they wanted to launch the cap on the day of the signing, and Waikato said, no way, not happening on our watch. It's nothing to do with us. You want to do whatever, but you can't do that to the rest of Māoridom. And one of the things that I noticed that the negotiators and Sir Robert were very conscious of all the way through was making sure that whatever they did didn't impact on anybody else's claim.
There was one thing in the settlement that really struck me talking to Sir Robert. After the settlement, Sir Robert, Shane Solomon, Hayden Solomon, and a couple of the other graduates from Waikato Tainui, were doing tours of communication around the Chamber of Commerce and whatever else to explain, not that they had to, but the memory that I have of Sir Robert is saying that we're going to lose a generation. We're not giving away money for gym shoes and tuition and all of that. We're going to invest in the intellectual capital of the tribe. Yeah. And that's what's happened. And 25 or 30 years later, people look around and say, where did all these educated Maori come from? Well, when I first got involved with Waikato Tainui, the education budget was $10,000. After settlement, it became $1 million. And the impact of that has been that there are probably 400 or 500 master's students, there's hundreds of PhDs and 4,000 or 5,000 bachelor graduates. And it's been fantastic because those people have come through the tribal businesses, replacing Pākehā that used to be in some of those businesses. And this is a strength for Waikato Tainui now because of the investment, Sir Robert Mahuta's vision of a investment in the intellectual capital of the tribe.
An anecdote that comes to mind about Sir Robert was a story that the late Whaingata used to love to bring up when we were having, drinks at the end of the week, and he would tell the story over and over again about Sir Robert and how Whai walked in to Sir Graham's office and the Beehive one day, and they sat down and he was having a giggle about the way of the discussions that he had with Sir Robert in the lead up to the final call. And he said to Whai, see this dent here on my desk? And Whai said he got up out of the seat and he looked over at this dent, and Whai nodded, and Sir Graham looked at him and he said, well, that was from the many times Sir Robert bashed my desk in absolute fury over the injustice and the grievance of the Raupatu settlement. And my admiration for him just went up tenfold because I thought, if you have the courage, the leadership to walk into the treaty negotiations minister's office and bash a dent in his desk, you deserve every penny you get. Well done, Sir Robert.
We've heard all of those recollections. Winner, you talked about some earlier.
He was very tolerant of me. I was not the easiest journalist to deal with, mainly because I was pretty done for a start. I was educated in Waikato tikana through my colleagues and friendships like with Hone Edwards, with Tuku Morgan and that. And it took a drive along the highway in Cambridge, and Tuku said, look at all this land, look how beautiful it is. And I was going, yeah, it's great land, horses and farmland and that. He goes, that's our land. This land is our land, and it was stolen from us. Then we got to Taupiri and he turned the radio down. And this was the mark of respect because we were passing the Urupa and Taupiri. And then once we'd passed, he turned the radio up again and explained why he had done that. And then he explained that that road was a deliberate insult to Waikato by colonial forces. They had purposely routed the road that way, close to this wāhi tapu, to point out, to teach Waikato lesson. This is how powerful we are. We are going to ignore your sacred spaces, and we're going to put a road through here. So it was that kind of history, learning about it when I was young and dumb as a journalist, that made me appreciate the treaty settlement more for Waikato. As I said, he was very tolerant. I would rock up on a Saturday, Sunday at 8 o'clock in the morning and knock on the door and go, woohoo, it's just me. I've come to interview you. And he'd still be in bed with the pugs. The pug dogs. Pugs. And he'd go, tai huakua, hariki waho. And he'd get changed, come out, let me ask my questions. My crew would be there with me and send me on my way. And when I think about it, he was pretty important. Yes, I imagine it was a lonely and difficult time for him negotiating the settlement, and the myriad of tribal affairs that he was involved in. But I think also that he was lucky to have support in those times. All those old people that he had and could call on at that time. Half of them scared me to death, just looking at them and hearing their names. But Bob was very approachable, very tolerant, and very generous, I felt.
But it's stoic, I think, the other thing too, from for a little bit later on, even when his health was failing and he wasn't well and he was supposed to be looking after himself and not having the cigars and things like that, but still working, just carried on working, mahi ata mahi, just constantly. And I remember one story where, actually you know this one, Suet, he was supposed to go and have his dialysis, but he was too busy. And he was seen driving across Hopu Hopu here with his dialysis bag on the roof of the car instead of having to lie down in the bed with it hanging up because it just took up too much time.
Just think about the cigar. You could always find Doug Graham and Robert Mahuta because Doug be on the pipe and Bob would be, I have the cigar, there'd be a little cloud over in the corner somewhere.
Not quite a halo.
Yeah.
Not everybody's settlement, we've touched on that before. Eva and a number of other tribal members not really happy. And some of those iconic images of the settlement outside at Tūranga Waiwai. How did you, as journalists, cover those diverse internal Waikato views that existed around at that time, the proposed settlement, but latterly, the settlement? Very difficult time.
I think it was harder for those who were Waikato Tainui, even Maniapoto, because they were being, more so than someone like myself, Te Arawa, they were being accused, my colleagues were being accused of not being on the right side of history. So I'll leave it to you. I'm sure you guys came.
Well, how did you feel, example, Wena, as Tūhoi, expected to report on that diverse sort of thinking inside Waikato?
When I arrived at Tūranga Waiwai and saw Eva outside the gate, e tangi ana, e apa kurana, I remember feeling quite shocked because this was a woman who had led Tainui on the Tainui Express, maybe a decade ago, up to Waitangi, and had the support of the people then, and had brought the people together on that issue. And now here she was outside Tūranga Waiwai crying because she was at odds with them on the other side of the fence. So that was the story I reported. About 10 years ago, here she was being a leader for her people and now was standing against some of the leaders of that tribe. That was the story I reported. I didn't get much feedback from it, but, we were mana news. We were being broadcast on Radio New Zealand, didn't expect a lot of feedback then. But years later, I happened to be interviewing Angeline Greensall, Eva's daughter, about it. And the sadness of that whole situation had been passed down the family. And Angeline was still quite bitter about it, and I think had still not come to terms with the way her mother, she felt, had been dismissed, and her stance on it, her and Bob were being at odds was something that wasn't easily reconciled. No.
The price of treaty settlements. And this was the first one through, as we know, that was reached. I came across Eva as I was walking into Tūranga Waiwai that day as well with my camera crew. And I had always felt very comfortable with her. And in memory, I still do. But she called me out immediately. And she said to me, in Māori, which side of the fence are you on, Hone? Kei te whetaha koe e tūana. And I said to her, Eva, my job is coming here to get your opinion and how other people feel who support the settlement and to get both sides of the argument. And she said to me, but you're from here. You can't divorce yourself from this kaupapa. You have to she said to me, I can't believe that you are supporting this kaupapa, because by not agreeing with what she was saying, in her mind, she felt that I was on side with the settlement. And I went away, and was that week, actually, I think that I grew up as a journalist and realised that, you couldn't just as a Māori language journalist stand on both sides of an issue, even though, in America it was evolving as we see today, that you can declare your bias, your political bias, and still hold the president to account as we can hold our own people to account. But it was such a new part of the treaty settlement infrastructure, and it was coming out in the angst and the pain of people like Eva, who in actual fact was very, very mamae, but she was tainui through and through. The woman that went on as Wena mentioned, on the train up north and then marching to Waitangi, she'd branch off and talk to people in the streets who they didn't even know who she was. These were just Pākehā people, and she'd chat away to them about the protest and then go back and join the protest and move on. But when it came down to on the day of the signing, it was a different story. It was a lot of pain.
Nodding your head, Ruben?
Yeah, I mean, it was a for a journo working in mainstream, it was really quite difficult because you had to take sides. Well, you had to be seen to be taking sides. You had to be seen to be taking sides. But I guess the thing I found hardest about it, most of all, were because you could get inside the hui, were the stories that people would tell you that were just. They were just wrong, they were character assassinations. And it was really hard, because I've been sitting there thinking, I'm not here to listen to what you think or whether Bob is this or he's that. I'm not here to do this at all. I'm here just to report on where we're going, where the next steps in that are. But people were very generous with their time to tell you what he wasn't. But nobody was prepared to tell you what he was, and you had to kind of learn that over the years as you came to know him and as you came to see the things that he did. And we can talk about legacy and all that a little bit later on, but that part of it was quite hard for me, was the kind of character assassination that people this is whaanau, this is hapu that are involved in settlement. It's quite normal. It's quite normal. I don't understand it.
I think you've got to be realistic. In any issue, anywhere in the world, there's always going to be a percentage of opposition. Now, I don't know what the percentage was for Waikato Tainui settlement, but let's say it was 5%. I think those same people 30 years later should be asked, well, what do you think of the outcome of the settlement today? And that's the judgment. And Sir Robert had the strength as a leader to back his judgment. This college here is an example of his vision. And out of it, we've turned out hundreds of MBAs and so on. And then it's sitting here, not in the way it was thought it was going to be. And I don't know the reasons for that. But this is a golden opportunity for the future to sort out. This is, I think, one of the last pieces of the settlement. It's got to be restarted and used in the way that meets Sir Robert's vision on it.
Who stands out in your interactions as journalists over that time? Paramena.
Well, apart from those who are leading the negotiations, Timi Maipi was a force to be reckoned with at the time. I mean, if Bob didn't muck around, by golly, Timi didn't muck around either. I remember getting a phone call, I think it was where there was those concerns and from people about how the money was going to, all the investments were going. And I was asking, okay, I'll have a look at it. And Timi Maipi rang me, didn't even say hello, who he was. He just said, what the fuck are you doing? And I said, well, I'm doing the story. Why don't you just come to us? I've got to find out, what everyone's saying first. He was going, learn it. You should know better. And just boom, hung up the phone. And then when I saw him a few weeks later, oh, hey girl, that was the beauty of it too. It was like boom and move on. They didn't hold that, we're not at high school here. They didn't hold on to those silly grudges or anything. You got a whack when you deserved it and moved on.
Yet I think these things were all symptoms of how tough the whole settlement process is. We talked about that $1 billion cap being put on for those early settlements in the mid-1990s, and that was estimated on the Treasury figures to be 1% of the value of the land which had disappeared from Māori's hands. Now that was much easier to quantify here by Raupatu, where it was very clear cut of what land was subject to Raupatu. It was a little bit more difficult in other places, but 1% is not, it was some. So tough calls, those ones, Sir Robert Tātipene, those other ones working in the background, Ta'achi, and that. Koro was a big part of helping in those early discussions with Jim Bolger, even though they would belong to different parties, but because they're from Te Kuiti, and they knew each other from Te Kuiti. And you know, they were farmers from Te Kuiti.
Koro brought them onto the marae, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
far as I know.
And that was, I'm not sure at the moment you'd get that sort of, that disparate cross-party sort of support, but it all happened in the background. And I think we got to a point later on, I remember it was the late Rawere Te Whare that summed it up well for me, is his people asked him, is this a just settlement? And he said, no, it's just a settlement, but we have to move on. If those tough calls hadn't have been made, you know, it sounds a little bit corny for something as important as this kaupapa, but you break eggs to make an omelette. And that's exactly what those ones had to do early on. Otherwise, nothing would have happened.
I just remember, obviously, the huge influence behind the scenes was the lady herself. I remember with our friends, because we were at Kohanga and through the kura, and they would say, we're waiting for the lady. Now, she didn't come out politically and let the negotiators and the front row do what they needed to do, but her influence determined a lot of what people were thinking or which way they would move. And I would say, how will you know? How do you know? And they said, well, just know. We'll hear. Like when they would even vote for an election. Who are you going to vote for? We're waiting for the lady. Very loyal, very, very loyal. But her quiet influence behind the scenes was huge.
So Douglas Graham referenced that at her tangi when he said, you know, and some of the meetings, some of the negotiation meetings were held down the road. And Bob would say, you know, she's just in the next room. And he said, you could feel her presence through the wall. He said, it had an influence on me and it had an influence on us, knowing that her, with her grace and her presence next door, you know, and he said, particularly for keeping calm and being polite and doing things properly. But he said, you know, just knowing, and he said, I knew that Bob took great delight in telling me, she's just in the next room. Because that had a, you know, the presence came through the wall.
Yeah.
My voice of reason at the time was a guy called, and Matamena just reminded me, was Jim Ritchie.
Yeah.
And he was a guy that you could bring up and you could say, hey, I've heard all these things. And he said, come over. And you would just sit there and you would listen to him just very politely, very quietly, just articulate views and make you think about the things you were just about to write. And he was very, really good at it. Just, you know, he didn't take a side either way, but you knew where he was coming from. But I considered him probably one of those guys that was very influential around the time. I mean, you had taniwha like Tom Weiner and them that were around at the time, and they were just hard case, Binga Haggy and them, they were just really hard case guys. And they were, you know, on the ground doing a lot of work, and John and them. But for me, yeah, Jim was probably that voice of reason behind the scenes as well.
I think that's one of the successes of the settlement, is the growth of the new leaders. So you go away from Sir Robert Mahuta, where is the leadership? And I look at today and see people like Tukurangi Morgan, who I have the utmost respect for, Rahui Papa, Parikawhia McLean. These are all people who have become big in New Zealand. You don't see any Maori news without Rahui being asked to comment on something. And I love the way he talks, the stance and so on. He's become a giant in Waikato Tainui. So the hope for Tainui in the future is this natural growth of leadership. Because there was a time in New Zealand, going back 50 or 60 years, about Maori in business. You know, they're always failing. And I remember the late Hari Puki saying to me, he said, Gordon, he said, remember when New Zealand went broke and the government had to bail it out with $1 million or whatever the figure was? He said, you know, there were no Maori on the board. And I've told that story a number of times because it was a critical comment on New Zealand business. And now we have the broad Maori economy right throughout the country that has become the strength of the country and of the regions. And Waikato Tainui has really been doing its part since that settlement.
Okay, I want you to reflect on some of those anecdotes or stories that you have of that relationship between, because it was very close, between Sir Robert and also Sir Doug Graham. I'll go to you, Wena.
I did not get the opportunity to interview Doug Graham until maybe 10 years ago now. And on reflection, he was very proud of what he managed to achieve for Tainui, but he also recognised that it wasn't enough. He valued the friendships that he forged through the settlement with Sir Bob and with Te Ariki Nui, and was talking about how once the settlement had been signed, he was on his way back, driving back by himself to Auckland, and on the straight towards Auckland, Taupiri Maunga sort of loomed up and the sun was shining. And it hit him then that the years of work was finally over. And he started crying. Hearing Sir Douglas Montrose Graham talking about that, you know, in a one-on-one interview was quite poignant. I must admit that, you know, I just saw him in previous years as another Pākehā politician who should have done more for Māori. But in listening to his recollections about the, you know, the completion of the Tainui settlement and his overwhelming emotional response to it, you know, I found that quite moving.
A little bit later on, when Bill Birch, as the finance minister, was wanting to split up EC&Z, the old electricity corporation in New Zealand, and that's when, you know, the river authority didn't exist then, hadn't been formed, and the harbours and the rivers that were mentioned before hadn't been started. The issue was that Bob was saying you have to resolve those issues before you split this up because it was impacting on what bit of hydro and etc. would be privatised. Like the broadcasting case, it was you lose the ability to have any control and any recompense, or if the Crown sells up, privatises any part of that hydro scheme, then how are they going to address the river issues with Waikato Tainui and the other river iwi back up to Tūwharetoa? And they continued on and they were going to split it up. Waikato Tainui went to court and was successful in getting an injunction stopping the split. All hell broke loose at Wellington. No one thought that the tribe would be successful in getting that injunction. I'd been away in Auckland and I got back at the court just when the decision had been handed down. And Shane Solomon comes running out. We got it. He was just as surprised as anybody else. And all of the Crown lawyers, Transpower, all of the power company lawyers came straight out of the court and went up the road to the appeal court and lodged their appeals just before the court closed that evening. And there was going to be an urgent appeal heard the next 11 o'clock the next morning. I went over and had breakfast with Sir Robert and with Shane at the James Cook the next morning because it was right next to Radio New Zealand. And I said to him, hey, have you done a deal? Have you talked to Bolger overnight? Have you talked to Doug Graham? And they hadn't. And he looked at me and he says, actually, that's a damn good idea. Shane, get Doug Graham on the phone. And Shane said, I don't have his number. So I rang on my Radio New Zealand reporter's phone. I rang his press secretary, Rose Hart. And Doug Graham just happened to be walking past her at the time we were talking. I heard him in the background. She said, "Oh, hang on a moment." And I've got him on the phone here now. So Bob and Doug had a conversation about that on my reporter's phone that I was sitting there, not allowed. I said I wasn't taking any notes or anything. And they went at 9:30 down to Beehive, had a meeting. We got to the appeal court just before 11 o'clock. And Shane says, we went out the back, we've done a deal. We've done a deal. He said, so when the court convenes at 11 o'clock, we're going to withdraw our injunction. We're going to drop it. And so I got out and got that story on the 11 o'clock news before it came out in the court. But it was that relationship. Once they'd actually had the conversation, within 2 hours, they'd actually gone away, had a cup of tea in the morning. By the time the appeal court came at 11 o'clock, they'd fixed it.
Because that was 1996 and ECNZ was about to split itself into Genesis, Meridian and Mercury. And the assurance that Sir Robert was wanting, and Lady Mahuta, she was there as well at the time, and Denise, was that their split would not affect the river claim. And Sir Douglas gave them that assurance.
The settlement would not have happened, in my humble belief, without that relationship.
Totally.
Because it takes two parties to come to the table and want
To talk.
to want to reach a solution together. And both of them were absolutely committed to that.
Another one at that time, Tuku was an MP.
That's right.
And I was talking to him, he said, and he was part of the government because it was a New Zealand First National Government. And he said, I'll cross the floor and I'll vote against it. I said, that's a big drama if you cross against it. But he didn't tell Tau, he didn't tell Winston, told nobody. And so I went and interviewed him, got him on tape, and I said, Tuku, you know that when I put the story on Radio New Zealand, the whole press gallery is going to descend down on this office and want you to talk to them as well. Kei te pai, all right, boy, fine. What I found out later is it was on 11 o'clock news in the morning, and it did, the whole place blew up. Bolger's office was ringing Winston's office. What the hell are you doing? What's going on? So Winston was ringing Tau. I don't know. And Tuku's response for when I said that the whole press gallery would turn up is apparently him and his EA had locked up the office, got in a taxi, gone to the airport and flown back to Hamilton and weren't seen for nearly 2 weeks. Just disappeared up here somewhere around Huntly. And that was it. And so Tianga went out to interview Bob about it. And he said, I don't care what he does. He doesn't represent the tribe.
Interesting, isn't it? That whole notion of rangatira ki te rangatira. What are some of the lessons from that period do you think will help the thinking now? There's a whole new kohanga reo generation. They've come through all of that. And some would argue that some of those conversations set the platform actually to move forward to another space.
There's something happening with Shane Solomon, who was at the heart of all those negotiations with Sir Robert. He's just recently been awarded his PhD, and the thesis is on after the settlement. Now, it's all fresh, but when that becomes available, that will be a huge historical reference for the treaty and what happened subsequently, with people named and actions and all of the dramas. So I'm personally looking forward to the ability of reading Shane's thesis or reading the thesis in a book form. And there's going to be some time before that happens, but that is, I think, a significant moment in treaty history.
I think some of the lessons you can take from it is that, and we saw it at the last election when this kura generation finally voted, and what they did is they stood up for something. Whether they voted for the Māori Party, which it appears from what we know that's what they did, but they stood up for something. And you see, this is the thing about Bob as well, is he stood up for something. It may not have been perfect, it may not have been right, but he stood up for it. And, I talked about that story about him at that hui when he threatened all these guys, And I couldn't. It took me about 10 years to figure out what he had actually done that day. But what he was trying to do was just to try and galvanise people. And because if you remember the next day, he said, we're going to walk up to Taupiri and we're going to block off the motorway and we're going to walk up there and we're going to send a signal to this government that we're serious. It was serious, so that's what we did. We all marched up to Taupiri. We stood right in the middle there, and I can remember seeing all these angry people looking at us, and I was just thinking, this is hilarious. In fact, I tried to convince Huni Harawira to do it up north once. He didn't think that I was serious, but just the effect that it had that particular day was to galvanise people, and it was the other part of it too, is that you need to galvanise people. You need to take them for a ride, take them for the ride with you. That's what he did by his actions that day. As hilarious as I found it, I just think it was part of his kind of leadership was to say, I'm serious, I'm going to take a stand on this, and I'm willing to show you guys how serious I am.
I think one of the things about the settlement, especially pre-settlement, was Waikato, Maniapoto, we'd all heard the stories of the Raupatu, and when it came time to getting into those negotiations, we had the constant care of the old people around the room who never spoke really, but their silence was loud. Apart from that, we had that repository of knowledge that came with them, and it was unbroken since the time of the Raupatu. And because of that, that was to me a winning trump card for the tribe. All the consultations, and there were hundreds of them over those years leading into do we sign or do we not? And when we sign, who should sign? Should it be her? Should it be him? All those old people very gently and graciously guided a lot of that decision making without saying a word, a lot of them. And like I said, I don't know that we would have that today, but what I do think is that with grievance needs to come graciousness. You have to give and take. In our case, we were first. Somebody had to make up a rule and go, okay, across the table, we agree that we're going to do this. And taking the people with you was part of that consultation hui, and all the PR that went along with it, and all the messaging, and having a postal referendum so that people could vote, which wasn't required. I mean, all of those things were really kind of, another G word, groundbreaking, because that's what we were doing, breaking ground.
Some would argue that the profile of Waikato as a whole hasn't actually changed that much since settlement. It's a very difficult question, but one actually that we should ask ourselves.
Profile with who?
The iwi profile. We are all still better.
In whose eyes?
Hey, good question. In whose eyes?
Because I think that's changed a lot.
Yep.
And because even
I'm
after...
trying to provoke some thinking.
Yeah, and I'll give an example why. After Gordon's work with TGH, me and my colleague Brian, we ended up doing a couple of the annual reports in around about 2008-ish, 2007, and that's when the recovery they were really starting to boom. And there was that 3-year period where we're heading towards the $1 billion mark of the value of the tribe, the asset value of the tribe being $1 billion, which is a remarkable story in itself, coming from where the settlement was. And yeah, there were some hiccups and it went backwards for a bit. Tell me a business that hasn't. The early stages of Ruakura was starting to be crystallised by Mike Pōhio and John Spencer. And getting up there, and we had this amazing financial performance. And my Pākehā colleague Brian, he said, this should be going to the business desk of the Waikato Times, not to the Māori Affairs reporter. So it might have been John Stokes at that point. Sorry, John, you miss out. And we went and saw Chris Gardner, I think that was his name, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Who was the business editor. And my colleague Brian said to him, I want you to look at one thing. Look at the balance. Look at the numbers in the back, never mind all the commentary at the front, and tell me how many companies in Hamilton and the Waikato are bigger than this? And they went, oh, Fonterra, obviously. Yeah, absolutely. Gallagher Group, Perry's. Who else? And there was just the stunned, and he went, oh. And the next day, the front page of the Waikato Times was business success. So all of the raru that Waikato Times had been doing for the years leading up to 2007, obviously some of it was justified. It changed it because let's look at it from what the numbers actually say. And so I think then the relationship with the city council, the relationship with, that started changing a lot.
I don't think it came out of one headline, though,
No, but in terms of the eyes of the public,
Simmering.
the Waikato Times, which was the mouthpiece for so much of mainstream Waikato in Hamilton, started treating the tribe completely differently. The public then started viewing it very, very differently for the success of the base and ancillary and then the Ruakura stuff.
Yeah, I
And that was
absolutely
that. So
agree.
that's why I asked, in the eyes of who has the profile changed?
I absolutely agree with those comments because there were two entities, if you like, in the Pākehā world. There was Tainui Group Holdings, TGH, and there was Waikato Tainui here. And I watched TGH communicate each year. They would hold a financial performance presentation out at the base, and there would be 400 business leaders from the Waikato, Pākehā, sitting in that space and listening to very, very professional presentations on the success of TGH and its impact on the economy, jobs, buildings, developments. And I think that started to turn the tide where people, Europeans, Pākehā, say, we've got this fantastic tribe, they're doing really well, major contributor to the economy, and they're biggest single ratepayer in the history of Hamilton. So this success is starting to be repeated. Now that's something we didn't see before the settlement, because the tribe, if you like, was like a private club. Of what interest is the tribe's business to Pākehā? You know, this is a closed shop. So it's a bit like Sir Tipene O'Regan coming out and using the Pākehā techniques to communicate outside the tribe. The tribal communication, which I was involved in the early days, was very difficult because there wasn't the email, it was a database, the tribal roll that Maura Solomon looked after, 21,000 people. To reach them, you had to print a newsletter, put some stamps on an envelope, put the newsletter in the envelope and mail 21,000 of them at the Ngaruawahia post office. That was a huge job, whereas today, I don't know quite how it's done, but if there's a great database, you can email the tribal base, or you should be able to, within seconds and communicate critical information. You know, Fonterra had a similar problem. They had, 8,000 or 9,000 suppliers all over New Zealand. And how did they communicate? They had dairy farm shed meetings where 40 or 50 farmers would turn up into one farmer's shed, and then the communication from the company would go through those shed meetings. They didn't need the media to communicate to their target market, which were the farmers. And it's the same with Tainui. Waikato Tainui does not need the media to communicate to its members if it has a professional group doing that communication through the electronic social media means.
Yeah, so it's all on you, Jace.
It's not just iwi holdings.
No. Yeah.
Though throughout the waka, we've seen the stunning emergence of so many SMEs, smaller business enterprises, Māori enterprises, working in primary, exports. So you've seen that whole surge of economic growth across the waka as well.
The cynical me and thinks, yeah, I love that we're sticking it to Pākehā. I love that Waikato and Tainui, we're sticking it to Pākehā at that time. You know, I think these tribes had been dismissed, and yet we're coming through as an economic powerhouse, contributing to the New Zealand economy in stealth, I think, But, and suddenly, you know, they were flavour of the month because they had so many zeros after their name.
I think what's interesting is that the bad settlement, the one settlement starting with W that we won't really talk about, but involved sport and a few other things, overshadowed a lot of the good stuff that happened after that, and that people remember that time post-settlement when we bought league teams and things. But our people were very well informed, really, during the time pre-settlement and at settlement time, because we attended Pokoi, we attended Hui, we went to consultation meetings. Ngā Marae Tōpū was strong then. You know, all those iwi entities that we had going. Our trust boards were fully informed because they had members on there, you know, and those sorts of things. So the communication to our own people was good. I'm not sure that we have that now. We don't have those attendants at Hui. We wait for the live thing on Facebook or wherever and watch 10 minutes and then, had enough, and switch it off. Wait for Auntie to tell us maybe, or get a view from someone else. And I think that that's communicating our success stories. When I sat in your seat in 98 to 2000, I was at the time of the Warriors and other things, and defending the tribe about its investments. What was trying to happen then, I believe, was that we were trying to make some quick money because our people, now we had achieved a settlement, were expecting the benefits of it, right? So how do we turn that into quick money? Yes, some bad investments, but also some good ones that became lasting. And those sorts of success, nobody cared about those. I mean, I remember defending in front of media one day about the fact that Ngāi Tahu made shrewd and successful investments while Tainus were stupid and silly. You know, those sorts of things. And how to contend with the fact that 2 of our staff members drove BMWs, or that Sir Robert had a Lexus. I said, it's an upmarket Toyota. Would you work for 30 years for nothing? You know, those sorts of, we were always having to defend ourselves in terms of post-settlement. We didn't have a chance to celebrate, really, how successful we were.
You've got to tell the story, though, about the day the decision of the Warriors being purchased was made and how the people found out about it.
Oh, yes.
Go on.
Sitting in a meeting in Auckland, we're about to sign on the dotted line. I made a certain person ring Sir Robert and ask him, are we sure we want to do this? He said, yes, we have a long league heritage. We can do this, blah, 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 blah. We hang up, we sign on the dotted line. It's supposed to be secret, all right? Mm-hmm. Next minute it goes over the microphone, or over the speakers down at Tūrangawaewae that we had just bought a league team. And everybody was so happy and also quite stunned that we had bought a league team. I mean, that was supposed to be, so next minute, media, fronting all of that and answering, how does that fit in us being, you know, how's that going to make us wealthy? You know?
I remember I was in charge of a newsroom at that time, of a program in a newsroom, and that question on the Lexus came up.
Yep.
And the reporters, one of which was a Waikato reporter actually, we're talking about it and how inappropriate it was to spend settlement funds on a Lexus, and so they pitched the story, and I just said to them, "That's nobody's business."
Exactly.
That's not our business.
So that's a screw you moment.
Yeah,
You've had years of ballsing up this country. We make a few mistakes.
Shane tells the story, you know, like he answered the phone one morning here. It's about 6:30 in the morning. It's Paul Holmes live, asking why our Arakinui was driving a Mercedes. Fortunately, Shane had been in the supermarket and he had seen that Paul Holmes had bought himself an upmarket car. He says Jag. I always thought he was. It was a Jag. Okay, there we go. So he buys a Jaguar. Shane quickly said, well, you like nice cars and you're not a queen. So,
again, a screw you moment.
you know, it was the questioning all the time of the personal decision making, but as opposed to the commitment of what had happened. And that was really frustrating. I mean, like the day that we closed down the Tainu Trust Board and opened the Kauhanga Nui, the first argument was between 3 brothers about what their personal cheque was going to be. And I think that's, you know, for Sir Robert, he stood up and he said, the wealth of this tribe will be carried between its ears. That was always his wish. If you have that, if you have education, you will do well. And if one does well, we all do well. You know what I mean? That was his sort of sentiment. But the other thing about a Kauhanga Nui meeting, we're talking about some of the opponents. On the day of Auntie Eva Ricard's unveiling, Sir Robert hosted a hui of the motu in the chamber. And You'll remember that. And they all showed up afterwards, and I'm talking about Annette and Tommy and Mike and all of them. Showed up at the gate and they tried to get in. So the boys, in their wisdom, parked the tractors at the gate so that they couldn't drive through. I'm not knowing what's going on, and they're trying to ring me on my cell phone, which was not allowed in the chamber, to come out and deal with them. So somebody comes running and drags me out. I come down to the gate. I find out we want to come to this hui. And when I mean, like, there were a lot of the leaders, tribal leaders were in that hui at the time. And Sir Rob was asking them about their views on where we went as a country, you know, Māoridom as a whole, because we had settlements. And
was that the Congress?
No, that was post Congress in Kahungana.
Yeah.
And I walked in and I whispered to him, "We have Annette and Tommy and everybody outside, and they want to come in." And I love his response. He turned around and said, "If they want to talk to the people in this room, tell them to throw their own hui and put on the kapiti." And that was it. They weren't allowed in. He said, "We've got important issues to talk about here." And he didn't want their distraction, which was funny. I thought it was funny. I thought, yeah, okay, cool. So we said no.
Now, Tainui were mentioned, Ngāi Tahu were mentioned before for their success. And the period when Tainui went through some bad investments and lost some of the capital, people were saying, why can't Waikato Tainui be more like Ngāi Tahu? Well, a couple of years later, Ngāi Tahu went through the same rough patch. And their people were saying, well, why can't you guys, the leaders, be more like Waikato Tainui? And I just think, like business, it's up and it's down for everybody. And Tainui had a rough patch, but if you look at the balance sheet today, in tough times, it's doing as well, if not better, than most other New Zealand and international companies that are operating in this country.
But I think too that was the difference in the settlements, eh?
Yeah.
Ngāi Tahu got cash. Waikato wanted a land for land. And so that was different. We didn't have the pūtea that they had to draw on when they first settled.
Did we do enough to educate people around that treaty settlements process? Because the thinking, I think, and it's still resident now, that Waikato received $170 million in cash. So in terms of a comms out to the people, should we have done better in articulating?
Early on, though, the differentiation of what was value up to the 170 million, the quantum, the infamous quantum, versus what was cash was well known, but it sort of disappeared into the mist of time a little bit. I remember reporting it being very clear on what the cash component was, and that it didn't all come at once. It came in tranches. Early on, but I think that's gotten forgotten over time. I think one of the learnings of the treaty settlement process overall, how long did it take from Raupatu to get a settlement? And I think we were so impatient and so buoyed by the success of the settlement initially that our expectations of how fast we could do things was unrealistic.
Yeah.
And coming forward again from 1995 into about 2007, 2008, Mike Pōhio did some sums. He said, look, if we cashed up the whole of the tribal asset and estate now, and I think the tribal register was at about 50,000 people then, he said everyone would get a cheque for $5,000, komutu, finished, that would be it.
Good luck.
He said, and that was as they were approaching that $1 billion mark. What we need to get to is $3 to $3.5 billion, so that those assets will then be generating enough for us to look after our people the way we want all of the time.
But also too, people have to accept individual responsibility. A settlement does not solve your individual problems. And there is a lot of that. And I think that, tribes that have settled are expected to take on hefty social issues that they cannot do.
That was another one of Bob's comments. So I remember him saying that, do not let the Crown off its Article 3 obligations. He said, you know, we're here to do this and rebuild the tribal estate and grow our assets. We are not here to be a proxy for the Crown's Article 3 responsibilities.
I have been asked that question many times. Why aren't you housing your people? Why aren't you fixing up the main street of Ngaruawahi? Why aren't you fixing up the main street of Huntly?
Why aren't you?
And I said, that's not our job. That's what we have councils for. We are ratepayers. And someone gave me a figure the other day, which I thought was quite interesting, in that we have paid more tax as a tribe than we ever got in a settlement. You know, and that's an interesting figure to remember.
Kia pai.
I remember soon after the settlement, I was working down in Wellington, and I came across Jane Young, who was in the gallery at the time. And I was talking to Jane she was talking to me about the settlement and stuff, and she said to me, you know, we used to follow your stories, you know, so that we could get insights onto what was happening in the treaty settlements, and even talking to Rose Hart at the time as well. And Rose said the same thing. She said, we had no idea what was going on inside the tribe. The only way we could find out is by reading the news. And you were there reporting it all. And I thought to myself, when she said that, I thought, man, if I would have known that at the time, I probably would have reported things a little bit more differently, you know?
Yeah.
Probably would have, but I didn't understand, because I don't think anybody quite understood the significance of what was happening at the time.
Hone.
Yeah, I think the justice for Raupatu was more than a gift from the Crown. It was more than the money, and it was more than the assets that came in the final settlement. It wasn't just a matter of money, it was a matter of mana, and a matter of mana motuhake, and that was born out of the intergenerational grievances that we heard at the Paukai that was unique to Tainui. And the Paukai and that intergenerational grievance was about Raupatu. And we had a very firm and strong understanding growing up. When I was growing up in Kāwhia, where we've got 4 Paukai marae, the first time I realised I was a speaker of another language, was when I heard the word Raupatu, and then I asked my grandparents, what's Raupatu? And my grandfather says to me, heia hamau, don't worry about it, you're too young. And then of course I go off and I check it out because I'm nosy. And then I find out about this grievance about Raupatu. But it came right back to the fact that it wasn't a matter of money, it was a matter of mana, I riro whenua atu, me hoki whenua mai.
Kori.
Yeah, look, there are so many things, but the one thing sticking in my mind is more recent, and that is, since the majority of settlements have passed, New Zealand, Pākehā New Zealand's moved on from there, and suddenly we get the attack on the treaty. So all of the good from those early settlements that I sense as a Pākehā disappeared in a period of huge tension throughout New Zealand, marches, protests, New Zealand First and National walking away from a bill that's come from the coalition. And I think it's actually, I sense a setting back of the race relations we have in New Zealand caused by that action over the last 12 months. It's been appalling.
Marabina?
I think it's good to gather like this to remember the good and the bad, because from mistakes we have lessons, from lessons we have knowledge, and from knowledge we have empowerment, which is what we are sitting within today. What's been interesting is, more recent in hindsight, speaking to many who were involved in decision making, involved in negotiations, is that when you ask them that question, what about the young people today, they're quite relaxed to go, we did our bit, we've done our time. It's for our mokopuna, for the rangatahi coming through now, to stake their claim and take us forward, take us to the next step. And they had faith that they would do it and do it well. Otherwise, what did we go through all of this for? So I'm one to complain about all these young people, but it is their time to take us forward.
Kia koe wina.
Who would want to be a Māori leader nowadays, eh? And I agree with Maramena that, and with Sir Bob, that the wealth of the iwi lies between your ears, so be educated and use that intelligence and use that legacy that has been handed over down to them.
Ka pai. AI.
AI.
Ancestral intelligence.
Ana, koia.
Like it.
Chris.
I think from where we've come from to where we've got, 30 years, and I look at how many are the staff and the emerging leaders who, when we were involved in it, weren't born. I think we need to remind them that what they've got today, and this is not to be churlish about it, is learn about, understand what they've got today, where that came from. I just remembering how hostile it was in 1995 about these things like I mentioned at the start. We've come a huge, huge way for the better as a nation overall. I take Gordon's point about at the moment we're in a bit of a sticky patch, but the tide goes in, the tide goes out. We will get past that, but we're going to have to keep doing that. And I'm reminded actually of something Tā Tipene O'Regan said on the day that their settlement was signed in Parliament a couple of years later, in 1997-ish, where I said to him, so that's it, fight's over, you can relax now. And he looked at me and he paused and he said, never, the crown is Leviathan. And I had to run back to the newsroom and look up Leviathan. But he said, there will always be challenges, there will always be something. And when I said, who would want to be a Māori leader now? And I think back to those times, hell, who would have wanted to have been a Māori leader then? So that challenge is always going to be there. And I think it's just reminding, hey, you don't have to be angry about it and don't have to be in siege mentality, but we cannot forget what those ones like 30 years ago went through to get us to where we are now. Doesn't mean we're not going to have, or our younger ones aren't going to have the same sorts of challenges. But hey, fight goes on.
So before we get to the final word, Sir Robert, sitting across the table from Richard Prebble, that infamous conversation, I'll leave that for you to talk about as we get into our final word. What did he say?
This is a passing on story that I've been told.
Yes. Yeah.
And I had to get 3 agreeances on that. This was the story. That at a Tainui Māori Trust Board meeting at Turangawawa House in 1990, just prior to the elections, Richard Prebble came and made an offer to the tribe of, now this is variances between $9 and $20 million. And in his rejection, Sir Robert said to him, I know where I'll be in 2 weeks' time. I don't know about you. And of course, history came to pass and Labour was out and National was in. And that's when the real momentum of things gathered. But just getting back to the generational thing that Chris was talking about and the lessons learned, we are now 6.5 generations since Raupatu occurred, and that we probably have 1, possibly 2 entire generations who have never lived under the shadow of the whole grievance thing. And I just, I'm going to sound like an Anzac thing here, but lest we forget, there are lessons to remember. And so projects like this are about us remembering what it took to get to where we are today. And that do not have a sense of entitlement. A lot of people worked hard because it's better to have nothing than be nothing.
Oh well, on that note, me mihi ka tika ki o koutou, tēnei o ngā kāhui, mo enei o ngā whakamārama, ngā kōrero, I uhia mai nei ki runga ki roto I tēnei o ngā whare. Nō reira, kare kore, ko te huarahi kei mui a tātou, he roa, he poto, engari he huarahi. Nō reira, ia ku rangatira, tēnei te mihi. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Tēnā.